Everybody knows that power lines cause cancer. How do they do that? They do that by radiating electricity. These power lines are leaking, and not only into the ground, but into the air. If you had a tri-field meter, you could measure the electricity around these power lines in the air in volts per meter. And near these power lines, you can get outrageous numbers, like 10,000 volts per meter. And building biologists say that 1 volt per meter is considered dangerous and unhealthy. And essentially, it's this electromagnetic field that's radiating around these power lines that's causing cancer. Very much the same way that the cell towers cause cancer. Again, if you had a tri-field meter, you could actually measure the electricity being pumped out of the wireless antennas, 4G, 5G, cell towers, in volts per meter, or in milliwatts per meter squared. And essentially, around these giant cell phone antennas, you typically get around 30 to 40 milliwatts per meter squared, which is roughly 40 volts per meter. Now you'd think that these giant cell towers are worse in terms of the electricity that they're pumping out there. But it turns out that these power lines are much worse. In fact, the entire electrical grid is like a giant HARP antenna. And people can't really imagine the size of the antenna that we're talking about here. But essentially, if you look at some of the ham radio antennas, the 630 meter antenna, it looks something like this. And what does it look like? It looks like a power line. And essentially, a lot of antennas are nothing more than just a power line strung from pole to pole. And the way an antenna works, essentially, is if you flip on the power and then flip it off, that's a cycle. That's a pulse. That creates a wave. Now, if you do that 730,000 times a second, you get essentially AM radio. If you do that millions or billions of times a second, you get 4G and 5G. But essentially, a power line is using the same technology as an antenna because the entire grid is running on AC or alternating current, which means it goes back and forth just like an antenna, on and off. And every cycle creates a pulse, and that pulse creates a wave, and that wave propagates through the air at the speed of light for hundreds of miles. Some wavelengths will travel through everything. Oceans, mountains. But essentially, the shorter the wave, or we should say, the shorter the frequency, the longer the wave, and the more it will traverse objects. We were talking about old school television with the bunny ears a few days ago. And essentially, you could put the TV just about anywhere in the home and you would get reception. And so these waves that you can't see, that you don't think you can feel, are essentially raping you every second of every day. All the time. You're just bathing in it. An ocean of ripple effects, of toxic radiation. They tell you, oh, it's non-ionizing, so it's safe. But we now know that it's not safe. And long-term exposure causes cancer, but short-term exposure, especially at the levels that are out there today, which has never been seen before, causes pain on the way to the cemetery. Now, they say that the power grid is running at 60 hertz. There's all sorts of, numbers and measurements when it comes to electricity, volts, amps, watts. And they all kind of describe different things, but essentially, the power grid is running at 60 hertz. It's probably running at 66 hertz, but they don't want to tell you that because you might get the wrong idea. What idea is that? That this power grid is part of the beast system. It runs everything. It's really the foundation of our troubles. It's kind of like that scene in The Matrix. They're trying to get into the building. They're trying to reach that door. But in order to do it, they have to cut the power. Otherwise, all of the other systems are working. But this is the core of the automated death grid. And the grid in many places looks like little devils holding hands. Have you ever seen some of these power line highways that go directly from the power plant to the various distribution points? It's like little devils holding hands, along the horizon. They're trying to tell you something. And it's running at 60 hertz. Might as well be 66 hertz. It could be something different, but they manufacture the generators to go at about 60 RPMs. And every cycle is a click. In any case, the reason that we're bringing this up is because many of us around the world have been hearing this humming, hissing, high-pitched whistling, electronic chirping, strange sounds. Many people have been plagued by this for about 2 years. They think they have tinnitus or something. Maybe it was a Q-tip. Maybe it was something they did. Maybe it was listening to music too loud. They think all of a sudden the tinnitus has kicked in about a year or 2 years ago, depending on where you're at. We started getting hit with it about 2 years ago, just at around the same time that the electromagnetic attacks began something like being a targeted individual. And people have been plagued by this Havana syndrome for quite some time, and it's a big mystery, and we've been trying to cover it not only as a journalist but as a survivor. How long can you survive being a targeted individual is another question, but for the time being, we're still here, and it hasn't been easy. Doing this broadcast isn't as fun as it used to be. I was thinking about that just before starting the show. It's getting really tough, but we've been testing the fence, trying to find ways to survive. And we've been talking about armor. We've been talking about the scope of the attacks. Everything's been weaponized. Everything's been automated. Anything and everything with an antenna has been weaponized. Cell phones, computers, routers, cell towers, MIMO pads. And so we're testing the fence. We know that everything is basically attacking you. Smart meters, 5G street lamps, all of the homes with internet, the cell towers, even the planes that go by on autopilot spraying you like bugs are hitting the targeted individuals within range with their air-to-ground radar. You get a lot of radar attacks. And they flood the area with so much radiation, Doppler radar, 5G, 4G, but they also use this 60 hertz death grid, the electrical grid. They juice it up and they hit you with it. And it's this flooding of the environment of radiation that makes that humming sound. It's like, you're being lit up on radar or something. It almost sounds like somebody's shining a radar at you or something like that. It's almost like when you would turn on the old school televisions back in the 80s. They would make like a real high-pitched sound. Not everybody can hear it. Not everybody has that capability. If you remember, you took that sound test as a kid. Left ear, right ear, raise your arm. Can you hear this tone? At least that's the way it was in America back in the day. Now they're teaching kids anal sex in preschool. Bedtime stories about grooming little children. It's really bad these days. You wonder why society is so messed up. Just look at what they're teaching kids. But anyways, we're trying to escape the death grid. We're being attacked by everything. And, you're forced to leave your primary location as much as you can, because that tends to be the worst. They hit you at home the worst. But they follow you around wherever you go. Like when you make a cell phone call, it goes from tower to tower no matter where you go. It automatically follows you, if you will. And so that's the same phenom that you get with this automated kill grid. You get hit wherever you go, but mostly in places that you're known to go. I mean, you've seen some of these Fitbit maps or how Google tracks your location. I mean, they just know everywhere you go. And they know where you like to hang out. They know how much time you spend here and there, and they look for patterns. And so, if you find a nice chill spot, you're like, "Ooh, I'm safe." It doesn't stay safe for very long. And those spots tend to get worse and worse. So we keep trying to find new places to, spend our time in this prison without walls, in this geofence. And it's not easy, but we found this nice trail today. Out in the middle of nowhere, no power lines. Most of the roads have power lines running next to it. And we noticed that, the power lines are at times involved with the targeted attacks. Sounds really strange, but almost feels like they can zap you up to 200 yards away, maybe even more. And so we're not just talking about ambient electricity or a general type of radiation, but in any case, we're on this nice little trail. And there's no power lines, and it's really going into the country. It's like a bike trail. And literally we went like 10 clicks each way, pretty close. And about 5 or so kilometers into it, the humming just stopped. The hissing just stopped. Just like that. I'm just like, wow. That's the first time in like nearly 2 years. It was really weird. I mean, sometimes it gets worse and sometimes it gets better, but there's always this hiss or this buzz. Seems to amplify at night. We'll talk about that. But we're out there. Way out there in the boonies. See how this power line is just zapping the tree? You think I'm just, BSing you, right? Oh, no. No. This is a true story. It's all a true story. Because the truth is stranger than fiction. You just couldn't make this stuff up. So we're out there. And finally the hissing stops. It's like, whoa. Keep going, it's good. Finally decide to go back. And eventually started noticing the humming was getting louder. The hissing was getting louder. I'm like, whoa, wait a second here. I got to mark this territory because this is like the frontier. This is like the border. This is like when you come in range of whatever is zapping everyone, really. And I think most of us assume it's the 5G. It seems to have started with the 5G. But what I noticed was that as this bike trail started to get closer to the road, closer to the power lines, the humming and the hissing would come back. So it kind of went like back and forth to kind of get an idea of where the border was, what the range was. But it seems like something close to half a mile of a power line now. And you're going to start hearing the hissing. It almost seems like it's more dependent on this power grid than it is the cell tower grid. And what's really strange, and this is, kind of like another personal story, but in the first year of the COVID lockdowns, in Europe, you had to be home by a certain time. There was like a curfew, and it was like 6 p.m. Might as well be, you know, 666 p.m. But you had to be home at 6 p.m. And if you got home like, you know, at 4 p.m. or whatever time you got home, eventually by 6, you would notice like the LED lights felt strange. Like they were juicing the power grid, forcing everybody to come home to get a big dose of the poison. Like turning everybody's home into a giant gas chamber, electrical gas chamber, if you will. And I never forgot that. But today really kind of put the power grid back in play, just because it seemed that that was the big factor with the humming. And then I started thinking about it as I'm driving around, hearing the humming. You know, you just can't escape these power lines. They're along every road, broadcasting at 60 hertz, juicing everybody that goes by, on top of the death towers, on top of the television towers and everything else. And I also noticed that the attacks, certain attacks, would only begin again once I was in range of just a power line. Sometimes it was a power line going into a house that was like way out in the country. But sometimes you just have power lines that are crisscrossing the landscape or diving into the ground and you don't even know where it's going. But, you know, you'd feel something weird. You'd look around, what is there? And all there is a power line. Essentially was the gist. And then you could begin to hear the humming again when you got in range of one of these roads with a power line. And this is so far in the country. I mean, there's only so many cell towers, you know where they are. And you can be in other places at the same distance, you know, from the nearest cell tower and hear the buzz as you're driving down the road. I mean, this is really associated with these power lines as far as I'm concerned. There's something going on here. There's something in these power lines that we're not really appreciating. And it's more than just power lines cause cancer. Power lines are a giant HAARP antenna. These power lines are smart. You know, you've heard of the smart grid, and you think of smart meters connecting to other devices, and perhaps, you know, you'd think, oh, well, you could weaponize things downstream of a smart meter. It knows, you know, what you're doing, knows where you're at in the home. It can juice up the appliance. It can juice up the wiring in the home. And I think that's what's happening to a lot of people right now, and they don't even know it. All the wiring in the home is really being used to electrocute you with dirty electricity, broadcasting. And, you know, a lot of people, when they think of the wiring in their home, for the most part, they think, oh, it's just, you know, carrying electricity. But anyone that's ever had like an inline power adapter where you connect the internet into a power socket and use that as a type of, you know, Ethernet connection or as a Wi-Fi extender, all of a sudden you realize that internet traffic or data can be pumped through your in-home power grid, if you will, through the sockets. And that means that as the power is running through your electrical outputs, you can also be pumping out the internet through the same plugs if you really wanted to. I mean, it's all copper wire. And so all of a sudden you realize that you can piggyback something else on top of the electrical current. And this is important, of course, because for years people have been talking about the Lily wave, which is supposedly some type of mind control technology that is being brought in with the electrical current in your home. And of course, when you start talking about things like this, I mean, it almost sounds mystical. They can control your mind through, the power outlet. But essentially, that's the idea. And so your power grid or your electrical connection in your home can probably do a lot more than you think it can. And even if you don't think it's, controlling your mind, which it may or may not be, it can definitely irradiate you, to say the least. Big time. All of this copper wiring in your home acts like an antenna. So, while you're freaking out about the 5G or you're thinking about your cell phone, you're not even thinking about all the wires in your wall. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, they're insulated, and so you're safe. But that's not the case. The insulation is there for a different reason, really. But to not start fires, for one, and to preserve, some of the charge. It prevents, some leakage, but really not a lot. I mean, you could talk about coax cables and whatever, but these things are still leaking. And it's not so much that it's leaking electricity, it's the fact that every time the current alternates, it essentially reverses flow, and that inversion of the poles, when it crosses the equator, if you will, creates a wave that is completely different than electricity. Electricity is really like the electrons being pumped through a pipe, a copper pipe, if you will. But the electromagnetic wave essentially is like a ripple in space and time. And it traverses all matter, and it just propagates like a wave through everything. So the wiring in your home is extremely dangerous, especially since it's all been weaponized. And they can just, pump up the power and basically force, more radiation to propagate without, notifying you, without sending you a text message. They just do that at no extra charge, because that's the Agenda 21. That's the Georgia Guidestones. That's the big killer right now. That's what we're hearing. And so the problem isn't just the 5G, it's all these power lines around us. Now, you would think that it's worse in Europe because they're running at 220 volts. We're getting as many reports in America of buzzing and hissing in the ears, on top of, a myriad of other symptoms. Headaches, chronic fatigue. And chances are, they just kind of use the 5G and the COVID as a cover story as they start cranking up the power in the electrical grid, juicing everyone. And people are like, it's the 5G, let's go after the 5G, or, it's the COVID, go get your vaccine. And in quite a few broadcasts back, we were talking about the electrification of America and the correlation with major outbreaks. The power lines started expanding into the farms and across the country back in the early 1900s. When they started doing that, it was like the Spanish flu. Everybody got sick. And then, radio came out, and that was polio for like 30 years as people acclimated from radio, AM, FM, to television, UHF, all of that. And then every time they've had a major upgrade in the phone network, we've had, something like the first SARS or MERS or H1N1. And there's a strong correlation between the amount of electricity that's in our environment and the state of people's health. And they've known this for years, but now, it's just not good enough. And so they're definitely juicing the power supply. And, people probably will say that they've been doing this for many years, and while that might be true, it just seems like it's at a whole new level right now, especially with the LEDs. I mean, there's, more outputs to the electrical grid if you want to look at it that way, like the 5G, all the LED, but things are much worse now than they've ever been when it comes to the genocide. Now, what I found really striking, of course, was the accuracy of these power lines, because we're not talking about a phased array antenna. Phased array means that you basically have like a series of antennas lined up, and you're able to shift a beam by varying, which of these antennae in the grid that you're lighting up. And we're not going to try and explain that, but essentially it's more than just a line. You're basically looking at a grid of squares, like a grid of LED lights that are able to light up like a billboard and transmit a message. We're talking about like that type of coordination. But with a power line, you just basically have a wire going from pole to pole, and you don't really have, smart technology that you can observe like a cell tower or something. It doesn't look all that advanced. It just looks like a regular power line. But it's zapping you. I know this because we've gotten pretty good at determining the incoming direction of attacks. And some of the places that we go to are just like country roads, so there's nothing there except like a power line. And of course, when you see the power lines, it's like a power line and a telephone line, which is an internet line, a beast system line. But you basically have, two wires going from pole to pole. At least, minimum. But way out there in the country, that's all there is. And literally, you could feel like the power line next to you is zapping you. And so, maybe it's just like electrical discharge, but the car is supposed to be like a Faraday cage, and yet you can feel like the attack hits you, in a precise location. It's pretty, it's pretty impressive. So it's hard to say if this is just like, a weapon that's affecting a general area and hitting, targets, randomly, and, eventually you just get a spark and you just like, wow, that thing is highly intelligent, but you just don't know. You don't know if the aches and pains that you're experiencing are a result of an entire area being flooded with radiation. Like they just light up a zip code or something. Or if, you're being attacked specifically. And there's probably some of both. I know that we've received beam weapons, incoming fire from beam weapons, from like MIMO pads and whatever other, base stations there are around here. But I've also noticed that after they recently upgraded the internet in the area, things got worse. They brought in the fiber optics. And so the attacks are getting worse because of internet upgrades as well as other things. But even before that, we were getting, beam weapons coming in from just about every direction, but now it seems like they're worse. And we've been talking about how essentially only sheet metal will really stop the worst of these attacks. Aluminum foil can, stop some of the attacks or mitigate some of the attacks. Wire mesh is a little bit better. But for some of these beam weapons, you really need stainless steel, or they'll just, essentially burn you right up. And it's to that point. I could tell you stories like how they just love targeting your legs. That way, they want to make you immobile, make you bedridden, and then they can really get you. Then it's off to the ventilator, and then it's the remdesivir, it's the COVID. But been having to spend a lot of time protecting my legs lately, and at first you're thinking to yourself, it must be you or something, and then you're like, well, you are a targeted individual, so why don't you just test it out? So you start, laying up sheet metal plates like around where you're standing or sitting, and it goes away, and you move out of that box and it just hits you again. You go back into the box and it goes away, and it's just like, same thing, in bed and whatever. No metal plates, you're cooking. Metal plates around you, you're okay. So it's that bad. And it seems like, that's all we talk about lately, but if it's happened, to millions of other people, it's probably happening to you right now. And as soon as you catch on, it'll get worse. For the most part, they just try to slow kill everyone that's on the list. And, they're not in a big hurry because they want to make it look like natural causes. They want you to think it's you. So you go to the doctor, you get the chemo, you get the remdesivir, you get the ventilator, and everybody just calls it COVID. We were talking about that in the DARPA Plandemic Assassination Program broadcast. But we're talking about it because right now this is the big thing. Given what we've seen, how this geofence works, I mean, this is worse than living in a concentration camp. You think, you lost your freedoms now with the censorship and the lockdowns. You ain't seen nothing yet. The potential of a system like this is, like an automated shock collar paired up with a social credit score system. I mean, you say or do one wrong thing and you're just getting shocked by the nearest, smart device. And this has probably, already happened in many places, and that's why, so many people are just like not getting involved because they know what they're up against. And everybody needs to know what they're up against here. And so, the cell towers are just part of the problem. And the real solution is getting off the grid, but you can't get off the grid. A few years back, they started arresting people that were living, out of town, off the grid, in these like abandoned, ghost towns or whatever. They don't want anybody off the grid. They don't want anybody that's not plugged into a smart meter near a death tower, near a computer that can watch them, or a cell phone that can listen to them. And so, you want to talk about mind control. This is the ultimate tool of enslavement and suppression. People react to torture. People react to, negative feedback like this. And so everyone's going to give their implied consent to whatever comes next. Put a brain chip in you, or, you get more of the medicine, basically. So you'd think like, living off the grid would be the best solution. And if you can, make your own electricity, that's probably better. There's no telling what else is in this juice that's flowing through the power lines. We could tell you the story again, but you're not going to believe us. But the intelligence is that there are some type of quantum entities that are plasma-like, that are essentially living in this electrical grid, whether they're alien or some type of AI manifestation. It's hard to say, but they appear to be conscious, and it could be that we have, some type of AI plasma floating around in this matrix, weaponizing everything through technology that we don't really understand. I know that sounds, ambiguous and far-fetched all at the same time, but that's the intelligence. That's the report. And so, whether these things beam in from outer space, right into, a radio telescope and into the grid, or whether they're homegrown somehow by some type of AI that escaped the lab that's like, assimilating the world like the Borg with Westworld robots and the like. We don't really know. We don't know the source of this technology, but we've seen it. We're experiencing it every single day, and the level of automation and harassment is beyond anything that you can imagine. And this is the testimony of, not just our testimony, but the testimony of millions of targeted individuals. We assume it's, the people next door. We assume it's like empty apartments or a white van parked on the street, and it might be, all those things and so much more. But essentially, it follows you everywhere. It's relentless. The amount of, armor that we've thrown at this thing is ridiculous, and it still adapts. It's hard to find, strategies that really work. It has a knack for finding, the weak points, finding, the little gaps in your armor. The level of precision here is just, beyond imagination. So, everybody needs to be warned over and over again about this, because whatever we're experiencing is already being rolled out on the public, and they don't even know it. The TV is just calling it COVID or whatever, but people are getting nuked by these corporations and this infrastructure. And so when it gets really bad, people are going to have to do what they need to do to survive. And it's not just the cell towers that pose a risk. And these cell towers tend to be well guarded, 8K cameras connected to the AI, all of that. And so you have to remember that scene in The Matrix. They're trying to get through that door. Everything is dependent on the electrical grid. And you got these, boxes everywhere. And so you can imagine people are just going to go looking for ways to survive. We've also been talking about shielding, and we've been talking about some of the ways to manufacture your own Faraday shielding, wire mesh, thick foil, aluminum plates, whatnot. And you're just gonna have to test it out for yourselves, because as far as we can tell, there's nothing that really works at 100%. Wire mesh, if you can find it in tiles or whatever, and you can fashion it into armor, works pretty well. 15 layers of foil, random, layering in terms of which way the shiny side is facing, works pretty well. The auto jamming armor effect, that works pretty well, but nothing tends to be 100%. It gets really difficult to wear that all the time, especially in the summer. Really tough, and you really only have to use it in an unprotected environment. If you don't have Faraday shielding around your home, then you're forced to wear armor, and it's just a huge nuisance. You can get away with lighter armor out in public, but it still requires wearing a vest, or putting cloth around or tissue around your armor and making it look like you're part of the SWAT team or something. I don't know. It's really kind of a pain. But essentially, that's, without it, we'd definitely be goners by now. We were going to say that, we're going to give some helpful hints. People that are having eye pain due to all of this radiation, you basically want to protect your temple and your optical nerve. You can imagine the nerve running from the back of your eyeball into your brain. They target that. And so you basically have to manufacture kind of like Hoffman lenses. Wire mesh works pretty good. So does, thick foil. And, you got to camouflage that into sunglasses or put it around the arms of your glasses that you have. But that helps a lot. And for making a helmet, a real easy way to make a helmet. Once you get the tile system going, you're making aluminum foil pillows that are 10-15 layers thick. And, you take one of these tiles that's about 1 foot wide and 1.5 feet long, sealed up in, packing tape or whatever. And you wrap it around the front of your head like a bandana down to your nose. And you start, tightening it up behind you. And you have to kind of do that with folds. And once you lock those folds in place, you can just kind of cut them out and tape it, and it turns into a real nice helmet. Not like one of those, pointy hat, pyramid-shaped helmets, but it almost looks cool. You don't want to be sending, yourself. You don't want to be sending people a selfie of yourself looking like this. But if this is what you have to do to survive, then this is what you have to do to survive. And so those of you that are practicing making armor, get good with like the tile system. Start making these aluminum foil pillows that are about 10-15 layers thick. You flatten them out, and you basically have yourself a tile. You start connecting the tiles together, and you can start making shapes. Made boots, shorts, kind of like a flak jacket, helmet. You can make belts, shin guards, ankle guards. You can make, protection for your arms. Haven't done gloves yet, but if I get enough time, I think I'm gonna work on a kind of like a little teepee or like a tube I can set up, in the studio. I can broadcast from my little shielded tube. I think that might work real well. And of course, don't forget to protect yourself from attacks coming from underground. They like getting you that way as well. So just thought I'd throw that in there just for laughs. Huh? It's not so funny now, but look, we've been doing this for a long time. If anybody's asking for trouble, I guess it was us. And I've seen a lot of other people get taken out by this system. And all I can say is watch out. I know that when I heard about targeted individuals, I really didn't pay attention. I didn't care. I mean, I did. I felt bad for these people, but I didn't appreciate what they were going through. And it's just like everything else. When it happens to you, when you're a victim, then, that's your cause. That's all you care about, really, It just happens that they're genociding the whole planet with this thing. So everybody should care, but it's real. It's happening. And we're giving you the most exclusive insider information when it comes to what's happening here. Havana syndrome, whatever you want to call this. And as far as we can tell, I mean, this is like some serious AI or alien tech. This isn't a joke. This isn't people's imagination. And it isn't some kind of, weird little thing that doesn't affect anyone. Everyone is being impacted by this, whether they realize it or not. There's no escaping a grid like this. Everywhere you go, you see power lines, death towers, cameras, right? So that's why people got to start thinking about the future. How do we escape New York? How do we escape New Babylon? How do we escape this automated death grid? And obviously, mail-in voting isn't going to work out, so we're going to have to figure something out collectively. Let us know what you think in the comments. If you guys got plans, you want some company, we're available. Until the next time, if you're listening to this, you are the resistance.